Welcome to all of you. Welcome to participants in Zoom and welcome to our YouTube live stream viewers. This webinar on global health in the wake of the pandemic is organized by the Clingendael Institute with support of Corbey, KNCV, TBC and AIDS Fonds. My name is Louise van Schaik. I'm head of unit at the Clingendael Institute, and the Dutch and EU role in global health is one of the fields of my expertise. I will be the moderator of this webinar. The COVID-19 pandemic is no longer dominating news headlines, but it's not over yet, as is illustrated by the recent severe lockdowns in China. The world's response to COVID-19 has laid bare the vulnerability of societies and health systems, further revealing structural shortcomings in pandemic preparedness and response. Currently, the world is looking for ways to avoid new pandemics, with talks around creating a new pandemic instrument or treaty to avoid and better address outbreaks of new infectious diseases. The Netherlands is actively taking part in these negotiations, whilst also reviewing its own role in the global health arena through the development of its own global health strategy. This is the first of a series of online events that will explore the complexities and key questions around the future of global health. We will consider what these imply for the Netherlands as it steps up its engagement in global health. This online event will discuss how the greatest global health challenges can be addressed and what role the Netherlands could play in that regard. It will include a snapshot on the contents of a new advice by the International Advisory Council on International Affairs on Global Health that was just presented to Parliament. We will discuss the global health issues with an outstanding lineup of speakers. I would like to ask you to give them a virtual round of applause. Peter Sands, the Executive Director of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria. Ilona Kickbush, the founder of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and perhaps one of the most renowned global health specialists, experts in our field. Dorette Corbey, the Vice Chair of the Development Cooperation Committee of the Advisory Council on International Affairs. And Dorette is also Chairman of the Bioresources Materials Netherlands Steering Group. And she's a former member of the European Parliament, so a long-standing international career. In addition, we have a video message by Anne Kuik. She is a Dutch member of Parliament for the Christian Democrat Party, the CDA. And she just left for pregnancy leave, so she made a video message for us, but she will return to the office in the autumn, when the Netherlands Global Health Strategy is expected to see the light of the day. And Ms. Kuik is a key political sponsor in Parliament of the Netherlands, stepping up its potential contribution to global health. So we're happy that we have her on board. But before going ahead with the conversation with these speakers, we would first like to hear from you. For those who are joining us through Zoom today, we have prepared 3 poll questions, and we have also enabled the Q&A function for you to ask questions for the speakers. Please make use of this possibility. Well, let's start with the first poll question. Let's see if we can get it up the screen. The biggest challenge in the field of global health is, according to you, the lack of pandemic preparedness, funding for health systems, access to health and vaccines due to inequality, zoonosis, so the spread of diseases from animals to humans, or other challenges. So please let us know, what do you consider the biggest challenge in the field of global health? I don't see people answering the question yet. I hope that you can see it on your screens. Do we have some answers yet? No, not yet. Let's see. Ah, there it is again. Probably now it's possible for you to answer the question. So the biggest challenge in the field of global health, according to you, the lack of pandemic preparedness, funding for health systems, access to health and vaccines due to inequality, zoonosis, or other. Please let us know. I don't see the results so far. Let me check.
Sorry, Louise, but there's no possibility to vote. We see only.
Yeah. I also see people have raised their hands. Probably because they wanted to make the same point. Okay. I'm just looking at my colleagues. Can we still fix this?
Let's see if we can restart it.
Now it seems to be working. Okay, sorry guys, once more. What is, according to you, the biggest challenge in the field of global health? And now see if we can vote. I can vote in any case. Yes. Yes, now it seems to be working. Can we see the results? All right, so most people consider funding for health systems the biggest challenge, but access to health and vaccines due to inequality is also part of the game. Other is part of the game, and lack of pandemic preparedness is part of the game. Okay, thanks. Then we have one question just to see a bit, where are you coming from? We wanted to ask you the question, my main affiliation is with. Please. That's the result of the previous question. Now we should have the new question. My main affiliation is with academia, government, the private sector, civil society, or other. Okay. Let's see what people made out of that. You please show the results. My colleague Joris. Yeah, please. Most people are from civil society, government, or academia, but also the category other is quite big. I'm in the think tank, so I also voted for the category other. Okay, thank you. Then a final question about what the Dutch should focus on in the field of global health. I wanted to hear your view. Should the Dutch focus at more coordination between health and development sectors at the national and EU level? So the often made complaints about global health being treated from different perspectives with regard to different objectives, different subsets of stakeholders. Can we play a bridging role there? Should we focus at establishing a new pandemic treaty to prevent future disasters like we just experienced with COVID-19? Should we continue to focus on what we are good at, or in other words, sexual and reproductive health and rights, where we have over a decade of priority spearhead issue for the Netherlands? Should we focus at more funding for health systems strengthening, step up our own contribution and also encourage others to do so? Should we put more funding to AMR, antimicrobial resistance, or in other words, that drugs become resistant and don't help anymore with treatments? Or do you see something else the Dutch should focus at? And this is, of course, a very tricky question because most people would probably like to tick all the boxes, but we want you to be mindful and make a choice. What do you consider the Dutch should focus at in global health? Okay, let's see the results. Wow, most people think we should have more funding for health system strengthening, but also more coordination between health and development sectors. And I think these are also among the issues where the new advice by the International Advisory Council on International Affairs made some interesting contributions. Okay, thanks. That's very good for us to know when going into the conversations of this webinar. Thank you. And that is, we're actually going to go into 2 rounds of conversation. One round in the conversation is focusing really on the Dutch role in global health, and the other round is really focusing on what is the international debate about, what are considered internationally in Geneva, the global challenges. And then we have a round of Q&A where you can pose questions in the Q&A function of Zoom. Right, Peter Sands, we're very glad to have you on board. You are the Executive Director of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria, one of the biggest international global health organizations. And previously, you have had an distinguished career in the financial sector and also on the crossroads between health, technology, and fintech. And you have also worked in health, research, and development in academia, related to very prestigious universities such as Harvard. I wanted to ask you, what can the world gain in economic terms if more people could have access to adequate levels of public health? And how is the Global Fund contributing also to this issue of health system strengthening that people in this webinar apparently find so important? And do you also see a role for the Netherlands to make an effective contribution in this field? Please, Peter Sands, welcome and good to have you.
Thanks, Louise. First of all, on the question about the economic impact, you were very kind in your comments about my previous activities, but actually, when I was at Harvard, I was totally unsuccessful in trying to get international financial institutions like the IMF excited about the potential economic risks attaching to things like pandemics. COVID-19, however, won the argument rather better than I did by actually taking several trillion out of the global economy. And if we haven't worked out that health has huge economic impacts after that experience, then I don't know what it is going to take to teach us. The one thing I would say, though, is that as humans, we tend to be better at recognizing what we have lost. So when we lose economic benefits, than what the upside is. And in the same way that COVID-19 showed us what the downside is, we should also recognize that removing the burden of disease from communities, and I'm thinking, for example, of poor rural communities in many parts of Africa and some parts of Asia, heavily afflicted by malaria. One of the most powerful ways we can improve social and economic well-being in those communities is by removing malaria. You see immediate upticks in labor productivity, agricultural productivity, attainment at schools, and I mean, in the investment case for the Global Fund for Replenishment, we've had independent experts look at the return on investment. In the private sector, where I used to be, you'd get excited if you had a 31% return on your investment, by which you mean if you invest $1, you get an extra 31 cents. But actually, when you calculate that for investments in getting rid of infectious diseases, it's a 31 times investment. You get $31 for every dollar you invest. It's an extraordinary return that you would never get in the private sector. You asked about the Global Fund contribution to health system strengthening. The Global Fund is the largest provider of grants to health systems investment in low and middle income countries. In this current 3-year cycle, we're investing about $4.8 billion. So that's well over $1.5 billion a year. And that's across a whole range of different types of investments, strengthening lab networks, strengthening community systems for health, strengthening the data systems, strengthening community health worker networks, strengthening supply chains. And we see that element of our investments as a crucial complement to also providing disease-specific interventions like antiretrovirals or bed nets for malaria. You also asked about the Netherlands' contribution. Well, obviously, the Netherlands has been a great financial supporter to the Global Fund and is an important voice more generally in global health and is playing a leading role, as you mentioned, on things like the pandemic treaty. I do think there's a few areas that come to my mind, particularly when I think about the Dutch contribution. First, SRHR, as you mentioned, is an area where both civil society and the Dutch government have great expertise and have shown leadership. And I would hate actually to see any dilution of that, because I think it's a really, really important aspect of the whole global health agenda that we can't kind of diminish or dilute. A second area is innovation, particularly around TB and drug-resistant TB. We've seen Dutch academia, Dutch technical partners play a critical role. And then a third area where I sort of think of the Netherlands as playing an important role is in the whole and very topical issue of how we tackle health challenges in conflict environments, fragile settings, they're sometimes called. This, I think, is going to be increasingly important. I mean, most wars actually end up killing more people by disease than they do from bullets and bombs. And I'm afraid the conflicts we're seeing around the world will probably follow the same pattern. They'll exacerbate the impact of diseases like TB, and we will see a long tail consequence from them. Back to you, Louise.
All right, thank you so much, and super interesting that you also talked about the conflict areas, because that's also where the Netherlands has this longer tradition of merging defense, diplomacy, and development cooperation. And indeed, particularly in these conflict-prone territories, this is the most difficult of all. So that's, yeah, very interesting that you point this out. I would now like to go over to Ilona Kikbush. She is the founder of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and probably the most renowned international scholar on global health and international relations. She's also very close to the World Health Organization and the other health organizations in Geneva, and very close also to the German thinking on global health. Ilona, I'm really pleased to have you here, and we've also cooperated in the past. It was always a great pleasure. I'm really interested to hearing how you view the role of the Dutch in this field, and also to what extent you think we can probably learn from other global health thinking efforts and strategies, such as the German and the EU examples. I also saw in the Q&A that Henk Meijer from the Netherlands Ministry of Health also asked if you could say a few words about where you think the EU is heading towards in terms of global health strategizing. Ilona, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Louise, and great to be here and to discuss these issues. And of course, great to know that the Netherlands is thinking about a global health strategy, is working on it, and is consulting on it. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Let me start with what should be the focus of the Netherlands. And I think I would agree very much, first of all, with the points raised by Peter. And as we've seen over the last years, especially sexual and reproductive health and rights is consistently endangered. And to have a group of countries that are always standing ready to push that, to stand up for that, is incredibly important. So I couldn't agree more with him also as a woman that this area is so absolutely crucial, and it needs countries to spearhead that. I also agree with his other points, but I'd like to add another, because, you know, the Netherlands, as far as I see it, is a very open and connected international society. And therefore, it's also one of these, as we say in political science, middle powers that is very dependent on international cooperation and various forms of collaboration, meaning the multilateral system. And we're in a situation right now where that multilateral system, its rules, its various treaties we already have are very much endangered. And therefore, you know, the whole cooperation in global health as an absolutely key area of multilateralism and cooperation, and that also includes the EU dimension, is very, very important. And we really need the Netherlands as one of these middle powers to move that forward. Thinking of what happened in Germany around global health, it's a process of about 10 years now, and was related to a number of other events like G20 and G7 presidencies of Germany, was related to a strong personal commitment by the German Chancellor. And we saw throughout the whole process that global health, and we've seen it with COVID-19, relates to so many government sectors, relates to economic growth in a country, relates to trade issues, relates, and something we've neglected in the past, so much to research and innovation, that therefore it's very important to have the head of government really involved and committed to a global health strategy, and to be able to carry it forward very systematically. That also led to the fact that in Germany, the understanding of global health changed very frequently, and I'm not quite sure how it is in the Netherlands, but when people say global health, they mean health and development. And they mean overseas development assistance. They mean issues that are incredibly important for low and middle income countries. And that, of course, is highly important. But global health is more, as we've seen during the pandemic. Health is one of the largest industries in the world. Pandemics need all countries to work together. We need to share data across countries. We need to share pandemic preparedness and response across countries. So the really important thing as you embark on a global health strategy is not to have too narrow an understanding on global health. And for Germany, it was very important to have a parliamentary process to actually accompany the government mechanisms that went into the drafting of such a strategy. As you know, Germany is now in the second reiteration of a global health strategy. And there was a big discussion in Parliament, if we have a subcommittee on global health, where should it be? Should it be with development, a subcommittee of the Development Committee, or of the Health Committee? And the revolutionary decision was it should be a subcommittee of the Health Committee because of all the links, because the Health Ministry is the ministry responsible for the World Health Organization. Now in the new coalition government, we have the subcommittee actually linked to two committees, to the Health Committee and to the Development Committee. And I think, you know, we've seen an incredibly important role of this parliamentary committee, asking questions of government, taking the discussion on global health into parliament, really, really critical. Another thing Germany did was to establish a stakeholder process that advised the government on global health. They actually used the same stakeholder process as in the G7 and the G20, you know, business, civil society, science, women, etc. And they all inputted into this process. And Germany established an international advisory board with representatives of low and middle income countries and international organizations so that they heard the voice of the others. What are our expectations? I'm thinking of the International Advisory Board and its members of Germany. So that dynamics, what does the world expect of us? What do we want to contribute is very, very important. And
Wow.
then, of course, all ministries were consulted, and the process was adopted in cabinet. And the very last thing I'll say, all this process is now a similar process that Germany has taken into the European Union. And the French presidency hopes to have council conclusions that agree to revise the present global health strategy of the Commission and to make it up to date and to make it a really politically relevant document.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And maybe for the second round, we could go maybe a level deeper for the Q&A. But this is fascinating. And it also means that we need to have Margarethe and parliamentary committees and the ministries and the stakeholders really well organized and set up, which might not be easy in the Dutch context, I assure you. And I'm also pleased in that regard that we're now moving on to the next speaker, Dorette Corbey. Dorette, you have been a member of the European Parliament and also a distinguished researcher amongst others in the field of environmental and energy policy. And I remember when, well, years back, when I was working at Clingendael and we visited you in the European Parliament, you really always knew very well the details of your files and you were on top of things, and you also managed to link that to the political processes. And I also heard from several other authors of the advice that you were really a very good contributor to the advice on global health that is written by the International Advisory Council on International Affairs. Among others, our colleague Remco van der Pas, who also was added to the committee to help on the global health issues. I wanted to ask you, because you did not come originally from this field, what has struck you the most about the global health debate as carried out in the Netherlands and internationally? And could you summarize for us the main messages of the advice? We know that the advice is available online, people can read it. And many of the people here in the webinar probably have already looked at it. And I also know that IVE is still planning to translate it in English and to organize an event on it. But we would be interested just to hear, you know, a bit of the flavor, the key issues of the advice. Dorette, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Louise. Thanks for the opportunity to share the findings of the advisory Council with you. It's a pleasure to do so. We and that is Koos Richel, Marianne Jansen and Remco van der Pas, and of course the members of the whole committee on development issues. We have published this advice 2 weeks ago, and we are now in the stage of receiving comments and reactions, and that's always very interesting, and we learn about it. So all your comments are welcome, and especially if the English translation is ready, it's available for everyone. To answer your questions, so what struck me most, I've been 20 years ago, I was also very much involved in the issues like neglected diseases, access to medicines, the patents debates in the European Parliament. And what struck me back then, that the Dutch government was very active on all of these issues. I organized with the Dutch government a conference on priority medicines, which was very, very interesting. Still, the Dutch government is committed to global health, but the scope has reduced very much. So it's now most of all sexual and reproductive rights, and the Dutch are doing a good job on these issues. But back then the scope was much broader. And for instance, there were many countries where health attaché was in the embassies. So it was a very important subject, and now it's a little bit more limited, but more focused. A second thing that struck me is that there's now much more attention to One Health and this whole concept of One Health. It was there, especially in 1994, when Louise Gerrit, Laura Gerrit published her book about the coming plague. But now the attention for One Health is much broader, and I really welcome that. To answer your question, your second question, the main message. Well, really, in one sentence, the main message is that global health needs urgent, more coordinated attention, and the Netherlands should contribute to global health. That's, well, in very short, the message. I will summarize a little bit for you the whys, the whats, and the hows of this advice. So, why global health? First of all, our answer is that there's, we made international commitments for some, most important, the SDGs, but also human rights. So it's very important to live up to the commitments that you made. Second, as Peter already said, so health is a condition for almost everything. For education, for economic development, for peace, for a lot of things. So I think health is very important in itself. And certainly the health inequalities are really huge. So some policies to reduce that, that is very, very urgent. So now come to the what of Dutch global health strategy. Well, first of all, we recommend that the Dutch follow the 3 pillars of the WHO, well, strengthening the health infrastructure, pandemic preparedness, and well, making work of coherence. It's all very difficult to do so, but these are in fact the main priorities of what should be of the Dutch global health strategy. But we also see there are some special contributions, so to say, where the Netherlands is maybe good at. And first, we recommend that we should make much more work of an integrated approach. We say health is not only an issue of the health department, it should also be an issue of the agricultural department, of the environmental department, of defense, of science department. All these departments, they should have a commitment to global health, and it should be coordinated. To what ministry, it doesn't matter. So there are the same discussions as in Germany. We had also in our advisory committee, but it's very important that someone is responsible for this. And I come back to that later. A second thing, a second contribution for the Netherlands is to build on specialities and excellent knowledge. Of course, you can build on work that has been done before, like the sexual and reproductive rights. So the experience the Dutch have, you should not put it away, or you should build further upon that. But there's much more to offer from the Dutch science and companies. For instance, microbiology, antibiotic resistance, all these kind of subjects are very important. Also diagnostic and methods, also digital infrastructure, all these things there are companies in the Netherlands which are really good at it, and well, they could have a good contribution to that. Then the third specialty, so to say, but of course the Netherlands is never alone in these specialties, but the Dutch are a very strong supporter for the multilateral world. And Ilona has noticed, and many before noticed that too, that our multilateral institutions are really in a kind of danger now. And I think they need support. They need also critical support. Some multilateral institutions should operate better than they do now. But they need critical friends, supportive friends, more financial means to perform better and more effectively. So that's very important to have a strong voice in that. Then still, if I have the time, still a few words on the how. Well, we identified some leading principles. The One Health said health in all policies, do no harm, very important. And also very important, a context-specific approach. So there's not one Western model of health that we should roll out over the world, but really look at the local context, and as the Global Fund is used to do, but I think it's very important to work in that way. Then to come back on the coordination at home. So we really believed that there's a lot of work to do for the different departments. There should be some responsibility. So the responsibility for global health has disappeared in a well, kind of black hole over the last 10, 15 years. So I think it's now very important to appoint responsibilities to make the Department of Global Health responsible for the content of the global health strategy, and also to make foreign affairs responsible for the really pure diplomatic side of it. And it's also a very important role. But other departments like agriculture, science, environment, they also have to contribute, because health is not an issue of the Ministry of Health alone. It should be a common problem. So, and then now we once having this done, we advise the government to start really with a big event and involve you, all stakeholders, and also involve some of the southern partners in this process.
Yeah, so really an elaborate consultation process. I think it was also very important that you offered this report, and it was also asked for by Parliament. So you presented it in a technical briefing. And now we would like to go to a video message of 1.5 minutes that was made by the Member of Parliament, Anne Kuik, so very much a supporter of the global health agenda. And I'm really pleased that despite that she left for pregnancy leave, that she still wanted to contribute with this message. And I also expect that she will be very active on this issue again in the autumn. I want to ask my Clingendael colleagues if we can load the video, please.
The publication of the IFA advice is a good step forward in knowledge and development of an integrated global health strategy. With this advice, the initial step has been made. However, a lot of work still has to be done. This report highlights the lack of coherent strategy on an international, national and subnational level between all kinds of authorities, organizations and local partners. What is interesting for us to investigate is to what extent we can increase cooperation with other countries. For example, Germany, who has already made further steps in the implementation of a global health strategy. Personally, this report has again made clear to me the challenges that are still ahead. It is important not to respond merely to incidents, but also structurally invest in national health structures. Public health has been prioritized on a global agenda as a consequence of COVID-19. This should be used as a chance to structurally improve global health. The only way in which we can prepare ourselves for future health crises is through implementation of an integrated global health strategy in cooperation with partners.
Right, thanks. So this is Anne Kuik's very positive response on your report, and also I think a clear intention to take it further. We would now like to move on to the second round of conversation, which is about contemporary challenges in the field of global health. So what are the key issues global health diplomats talk about in Geneva? And also, how is this relevant for achieving universal health coverage? For this, I would first like to go back to Peter Sens. Peter, if I may, can I ask you, what do you see as the main challenges in the field of global health? Now, the pandemic seems to be fading out, at least in the West. And we see, the headlines in the newspapers about the ongoing war in Ukraine. So how is the Global Fund fitting in the debate on the need for more coordination in the international architecture for global health, the new instrument for pandemic preparedness, and also say the global health and COVID response debates more general, for instance, with regards to the Act A facilitator that was established? Peter, can I give you the floor, please?
Thank you. And look, there are so many big challenges we face in the world of global health, but I think the biggest fundamental challenge we have is that politicians, the media, the public are all a bit fed up talking about health, and they want to talk about other things. And we risk actually global health being deprioritized, which is why I think this report is very timely, and why we need to make sure we don't let health slip off the agenda. And your comment about where we are with COVID-19 is a kind of indicator of the challenge we have, which is that everybody wants to think COVID-19 is over. The problem is nobody's told the virus that. We will have new variants, and it's a roll of a dice as to whether or not they are going to be milder or more virulent. And the other issue we have is we seem to be slipping into a pattern that we've seen before with diseases like HIV and TB, which is that when pandemics stop being seen as a mortal threat in the rich countries of the world, we kind of deprioritize them and tend not to talk about them as pandemics. Nobody talks about TB as a pandemic, but it is a pandemic. Any rational analysis of TB would describe it as a pandemic. It's just a pandemic that doesn't kill very many people in rich countries. The other reason I'm concerned about this, where we are on the political agenda, is I actually think we are now lurching into the next health crisis. We haven't finished with COVID, but we're into the next health crisis. And it's a health crisis triggered indirectly by the war in Ukraine. Because the impact on global energy prices, the impact on global food prices and food availability is going to hit exactly the communities who are most threatened by the biggest infectious diseases. It's the poor, the marginalized, the vulnerable, it's displaced people. You couple that with the increasing disruption we're seeing from climate change related extreme weather events, and I think we face a very, very challenging outlook, particularly for those who are the poorest, the most marginalized, the most vulnerable. You asked about the Global Fund's role. We are a passionate believer in the notion that you only achieve massive change in health and well-being for people, and all people, not just the wealthy and fortunate, if you bring together multiple stakeholders, that you involve multilaterals, bilaterals, technical partners, that you involve civil society, the communities who are affected, the private sector, academia. We need all the strengths, all the distinctive expertise and assets of all these players to be able to achieve our goals. And it is one of the distinctive aspects of the Global Fund in that there is more. Civil society, for example, has more power way the Global Fund makes decisions than in any other global health or indeed global development organization. And we do face challenges of coordination and collaboration across the sector. Coming from the world of finance and economics, I was struck by the fact that the global institutional structure and architecture of finance and economics is actually much simpler and more concentrated than the very fragmented structure of the global health world. That said, I do think we have made advances. While far from perfect, the level and intensity of a collaboration that's been achieved through Act A for the COVID response is beyond anything we've ever seen in the global health world, and we need to kind of build on that. Finally, you mentioned the pandemic treaty. I do think it's important for the world to be debating and agreeing how we approach, how we respond to the threats that will undoubtedly come. But I also have a concern here, which is that the issues of inequities that we have seen around access to tools, to vaccines, to treatments and drugs and things in a pandemic are only part of the issues around inequities with respect to pandemic threats. The other issue that worries me is who gets to define what counts as a pandemic. Because the implicit definition in many of these debates is a pandemic is something that will pose a threat to people living in rich countries. And if it doesn't, or when it ceases to, we'll no longer think of it as a pandemic. And if we're honest, that is what we have done with diseases like HIV, TB, and malaria. We don't talk about them as pandemics, and yet that's exactly what they are. They're unfinished pandemics. And I worry, actually, we're going to do exactly the same with COVID. Combination of multiple vaccines, access to novel antivirals will mean it's much less of a risk in the West, but it will increasingly pose a continuing risk in many other parts of the world. And we don't know how the virus will evolve. So I think it's really important as we think about the way the world responds to the deadliest infectious diseases, that we're not just thinking about those that pose a threat to those of us fortunate enough to live in the richer countries of the world, but that we are truly turning the kind of rhetoric of leaving no one behind into reality and thinking about the infectious diseases, the ones that exist and are killing people right now, alongside those that may be around the corner.
All right, thanks. A very clear plea to rethink how we consider pandemics and also what that means for acting upon them. I would now like to turn to Ilona Kekbush again, being based in Geneva. And before the webinar started, we already talked about the groundbreaking effort that is now being undertaken by a number of the membership of the World Health Organization to increase the permanent funding to the World Health Organization, which was, I think, less than a average the costs of the medical hospital in an average city in Europe. Ilona, can you say a little bit more about how you see the international global health institutions architecture came out of this, and what is your view on the developments towards a pandemic treaty and to what kind of way of diseases it should be confined, and if it's at all feasible at this moment in time to have new multilateral efforts in place with the increased tensions in global politics. Please, Ilona.
Well, several points. I think, a little bit even, like the Ukraine war, what the pandemic led to was major health organizations working closer together. And I think Peter has already described this, and that Act A, and particularly also the political coming together very regularly of all the principles of the organization, etc., has actually given us an example what could be possible. And therefore, I think one has to work more on that. What we have not yet resolved is what I call the competitive marketplace of global health, which is, obviously reflected how we finance WHO, but all the replenishments going on all the time. And I think we do need some resolve at cooperation of how the financing is done, and what part of this financing we define as global public goods. And the OECD has started some work on this. Mariana Mazzucato and the Economic Council of WHO is starting work on this. I think that's our next challenge. And particularly because of this panic and neglect, and financing those diseases that the West doesn't consider important anymore, in the same way needs to rely on sustainable financing as WHO does. And we've seen during the pandemic how many of these really important disease areas have actually lost out during COVID because they were not considered relevant anymore. So we do need a serious discussion with financing institutions, member states, donors, etc., about this sustainable global public goods financing and financing at country level, which is also one of the key challenges in response to the pandemic. How are those structures created at country level? I think initially everyone thought, WHO was losing out in this context, particularly when Trump was doing his thing. But, the dynamics in global health and global health diplomacy are always very interesting. And people are sometimes, too quick in their judgment, because two things have happened. One is that countries got together to say, it's really time we finance this organization better, and have found a consensus on how, together with new accountability mechanisms, a 50% increase of assessed contributions to WHO can be assured over a period of 5 to 10 years. So this is really a breakthrough and a signal from member states. We want this organization to be strengthened. And of course, already in the Trump days, when the EU, Germany, and other countries came together to say, we support this organization, even if the US doesn't, that was an important signal. I think the treaty that you mentioned falls into that. And that is, the normative role of WHO is so frequently not considered. And with member states saying, we think this normative role is important at this point in time, and is also symbolized in a way in the fact that we get together around a treaty. I agree with Peter, one of the most important things about that treaty will be the definition of what's a pandemic and who defines it, will be the equity issues. The developing countries have said very clearly, we only agree to a treaty if it addresses the equity and, let me just summarize it, the sharing issues in the many things. I think, the agreement that we got on the assessed contribution indicates we could get an agreement on the treaty, even in a difficult geopolitical situation. But here I want to say the most dangerous thing would be to pack too much into this treaty and to expect too much of it. I always speak of the Christmas tree. Because, if we use the instrument WHO gives us, which is a framework convention under, the WHO, you make your framework convention, you can get an agreement on that in about 2 years. And then you take the really, really tricky issues forward in the conference of the parties. That's the beauty of a framework convention. And my last point here, again, in full agreement with Peter, don't think you resolve all these critical issues within the WHO and its environment. We need changes in the development banks. We need changes in the World Trade Organization. We need new cooperations for One Health, for example. So, it's not just staring at WHO. Is it good enough? Is it financed enough and whatever? I think some of the other organizations get away too easily because everyone sort of keeps staring at WHO like they stare at a snake, whereas the others, are far from doing their jobs properly. And we've seen the problems on IP with the World Trade Organization. So, and this even goes as far as revisiting what the G7 and the G20 do on health, and what legitimacy they have in relation to some of their proposals, and how willing they are to actually bring that into a truly inclusive debate. that includes the low and middle income countries in their totality. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I'm mindful of the time, and I will already tell you that we probably run 5 minutes late for the webinar, because I would now like to move on and hear what Dorette Corbey has to say about this issue. I think that already very important remarks were made by Ilona Kickbush and Peter Sens about the pandemic treaty, but also the role of, for instance, the WHO, but also the Global Fund. And I also wanted to ask Dorette, what now? You know, the advice is there from the International Advisory Council. What are, let's say, the next steps, and what have you asked for in that regard from the government? Dorette, please.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I agree a lot of almost everything what Peter and Ilona has said, so I'm not going to repeat it. I saw a question in the Q&As, I think Paul van den Berg, about the funding. Maybe a very brief answer to that. Yes, more funding is needed, but I want to underline that it's not always a matter of money. I think sharing knowledge is very important. It costs no money or hardly any money, but it's very important. I think it's very important to build capacity and sharing know-how about producing medicines and vaccines in a lot of African countries. So that is very important. It's not so much the money of the Dutch government that is needed, but it's also the knowledge and the know-how and the willing to share knowledge that is needed. So yes, money important, but it's not everything. So then your question about what next? Well, we made our advice, and the government should make work of the advice. And of course, we are willing to think with the government how to put the advice in practice. If they want to, but it's really up to the government now. We are standby to talk about the advice. We might organize a webinar like this or a public conference on this. We see if you have time to do so. But we are always open for comments, for questions, and if we can, well, share some light on our motivations for the advice, we are always available. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much. I was also looking into the Q&A, and I see so many interesting questions have been posed, but fortunately also a number of questions that were posed earlier on have been addressed by the speakers. And we also would like to say that we in the future will organize more of these webinars and also take into consideration some of the questions that are posed now for, let's say, the design of these future webinars. And we would also like to be very much part of this consultation effort on the new global health strategy if it sees the light of the day in the autumn. Maybe more informally than a formalized G7, G20 consultation process. But nevertheless, I'm very pleased also with the participants in this webinar. So many familiar names and faces, and so many people from the government and from NGOs and engaged in this sphere. So we clearly see that there is this demand for the debate on this issue. However, we should round off for now, and I hope that we can really get back to some of you with regards to these questions, and that we can continue the conversation offline. And we very much look forward to that. And I would also like to give a special thanks to all the speakers for today, because we know that you have super busy schedules. You probably already have pop-ups in your screen for your next Zoom calls of the day, meetings, and so on and so forth. But I think it was really fascinating to hear, let's say, what's on your mind and what's going on. So perhaps another round of virtual applause. We do it like this for the speakers. Peter Sands, the CEO of the Global Fund, Ilona Kikbush from the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and Dorette Corbey from the International Advisory Council on International Affairs, the Advisory Council on International Affairs in English, AIV, we say in Dutch.
Thanks to you, Louise.
No, thanks a lot. And we hope to see you back in future events and continue this debate very much so. And also thank you on behalf of Coordate, KNCV, TBC and AIDS Fonds. Thank you and goodbye.